The morning air at the training camp smelled of gun oil and salt water. The compound was tucked close to the coast, a place where steel rang against steel and shouted orders echoed against the barracks. The Navy SEALs had gathered in the open field for what had become almost a ritual, a skills exhibition, a way to test marksmanship, stamina, and precision under pressure. They thrived on impossible challenges, and when one of them hit a target others thought unreachable, it wasn't just a display of skill but a declaration of dominance. On that morning, however, there was an unusual figure among the spectators. She was small, quiet, unassuming, someone most of the men dismissed without a second glance. She wasn't in uniform, not part of the training staff, not even a military spouse by the look of her. Just a simple woman, or so she seemed, standing at the edge of the field with her hands folded lightly, watching the proceedings with calm eyes. The officer in charge that day was a seasoned SEAL commander, broad-shouldered and full of the kind of confidence earned through years of dangerous deployments. He was the type who believed every inch of the camp was his kingdom. When one of the younger SEALs set up an especially distant target, a steel plate barely visible against the treeline, the commander laughed, shaking his head. "No one can hit that," he declared loud enough for the whole group to hear. A ripple of agreement passed through the men. They were some of the best marksmen in the world, trained to shoot in storms, deserts, and freezing darkness, but even they knew there were limits. The distance was absurd, the angle tricky, the wind restless. Hitting that plate was closer to fantasy than skill. They grinned, nudged each other, already eager to try and fail, for failure would be no shame when the challenge was impossible to begin with. The rifles were lined up on a table nearby. Men took turns, each lying prone, steadying their breath, firing in succession. Shots cracked through the air, sharp reports that echoed across the field. Dirt plumed around the target, always off by just enough to confirm what the officer had said. Each miss drew muttered curses, some good-natured, some tinged with frustration. One by one they surrendered the rifle back to the table, their expressions saying what words didn't need to: impossible. The crowd thickened, voices rising, as if the group energy itself was building a wall around the certainty that no man alive could land a shot like that. That was when the simple woman shifted slightly, drawing a glance from one of the younger recruits. He elbowed his friend, snickering, whispering something that carried just enough to be overheard. "Maybe she wants to try." Laughter followed, harmless at first, but laughter that spread like wildfire. The commander grinned, not unkindly, but with the smugness of someone who found the very idea absurd. She did not blush, did not shrink back. Instead, she let the words settle and then spoke softly, her voice clear despite its gentleness. "I'll try." The laughter died in an instant, replaced by a stunned silence. The men stared at her, then at each other, then back at the small woman in plain clothes who had just volunteered to step into their circle. For a moment, no one moved. Then the commander barked a laugh that had a harder edge this time. "Lady, this isn't a carnival game. This is real steel, real range, real recoil. That rifle will knock you on your back." He expected her to retreat, to laugh at herself, to say she was joking. But she only tilted her head, almost curious. "I'll try," she repeated, and something in her tone cut through the arrogance like a blade. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't boastful. It was matter-of-fact, as though she were stating she would take a walk or drink a glass of water. "Certain." The murmurs returned, sharper now, carrying disbelief and a touch of hostility. A woman, untrained, daring to step into their sacred test? Some muttered it would be dangerous. Others whispered she wouldn't even know how to hold the rifle. But the commander, perhaps fueled by pride or by the hunger to see her embarrassed, motioned her forward. "Fine. Let's see you try. You've got one shot." The rifle was placed before her, long and heavy, its barrel black against the sunlight. She approached with an ease that unsettled those watching. Her hands were steady as she picked it up, her stance natural as though she had carried such weight before. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the commander's eyes. He narrowed them, studying her, but said nothing. She lay prone, cheek pressed lightly against the stock. The camp had gone utterly still, the usual shouts and drills silenced by the gravity of the moment. Even the gulls overhead seemed to have quieted, circling without a cry. Through the scope, the target was barely more than a shimmering blur, the heat of the day bending the air. Any normal shooter would be fighting doubt, nerves, the creeping knowledge of inevitable failure. But her breathing was calm, almost meditative, each inhale and exhale timed with precision. She adjusted the angle, the grip, the trigger finger's gentle pressure. Then, with no dramatic pause, no drawn-out anticipation, she fired. The sound cracked across the field. A moment later, A faint metallic ping echoed back from the treeline. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the realization swept them all at once. The shot had landed. She had done it. The impossible. The steel plate quivered faintly under the force of the impact, proof undeniable. Gasps broke from the gathered men, disbelief written on every face. Some stood frozen, others swore under their breath. The commander's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no words came. The silence that followed was heavier than any roar of applause could have been. The impossible target had been hit, and by the most unlikely hands. She rose smoothly, brushing a bit of dirt from her sleeve, and set the rifle down as though it were no heavier than a broom handle. Her eyes lifted, calm, unshaken, and she looked at the commander without gloating, without arrogance. Simply waiting, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He stared at her, struggling to form an explanation. Maybe it was luck. Maybe she had fired at random and fortune had carried the bullet home. But he knew in the pit of his gut that it wasn't luck. The steadiness in her hands, the serenity in her face, it had been skill. Skill greater than his own, perhaps greater than any of the men assembled. And the realization cut him deeper than he wanted to admit. The murmurs grew again, no longer mocking but full of wonder, awe, even fear. Who was she? How could she do that? The SEALs prided themselves on being the elite, but now a simple woman had stepped from the shadows and shattered their certainty in a single shot. The commander swallowed, his pride warring with respect, and finally gave her a nod. Not bad, he managed, his voice rough. She gave the faintest of smiles, not triumphant but serene, and then stepped back into the crowd as though she had never been the center of it. Yet nothing in that camp would be the same again. For in that one moment she had proven something none of them wanted to believe, that greatness could come in the most ordinary of forms, and that sometimes, the simple woman was anything but. The field buzzed long after the shot echoed into silence. Men who had laughed moments before now whispered with uneasy fascination, casting sidelong glances at the woman who had dared to do what none of them could. Some muttered about trick shots and luck, but the words sounded weak even to themselves. Others watched her in silence, studying the way she stood, the calm that radiated from her posture. She didn't gloat, didn't seem hungry for praise, and that unsettled them even more. Men who thrived on ego could at least understand arrogance. But serenity after a miracle? That was foreign. The commander stood rigid, every part of him bristling with the need to restore order, to reclaim control over a situation that had slipped through his fingers. He told himself that one lucky shot didn't mean anything. He needed to prove it not only to his men but to himself. Again, he barked suddenly, the command snapping across the gathering like a whip. The men stiffened, glancing from him to the woman, uncertain. She raised her head slightly, her expression still neutral, and said nothing. "Hit it again," the commander demanded, louder this time, as if volume could mask the tremor of doubt in his voice. She regarded him for a long moment, then inclined her head in the faintest of nods. Without flourish, she returned to the rifle, lowering herself with that same natural ease, like one returning to a familiar ritual. The men leaned forward, their breaths caught. The commander's jaw clenched. This would settle it. No one could do it twice. No one. The shot cracked, sharp and clean, slicing the tense silence. Again the metallic ping answered from the treeline. The men erupted, some cursing, some laughing in disbelief, others shaking their heads as though trying to wake from a dream. The commander's face drained of color, then flushed red. Twice. She had done it twice. There was no refuge in chance now. No one could call it luck. It was precision, absolute and undeniable. He opened his mouth, but his throat had closed tight, unable to force words past the raw humiliation pressing on his chest. He had scoffed, declared the task impossible, and in front of all his men a woman had shattered his words not once but twice. It should have ended there, but pride is a dangerous thing. A younger SEAL, brash and eager, stepped forward suddenly. "Let's see her do something harder," he said, his voice louder than it needed to be, fueled by desperation to reclaim ground. He strode to the table, grabbed a pistol, and tossed it onto the dirt at her feet. "Steal's one thing. Let's see her snap a target on the move." There were mutters of agreement but also unease. Pushing this further seemed reckless, even petty. Yet the crowd was caught in the undertow of their pride. The commander didn't stop it. He should have. But his silence was consent, and the challenge had been set. She glanced down at the pistol, then at the men around her. There was no fear in her gaze, no anger either. Only quiet acceptance, as though she had expected this from the start. She picked it up, testing its weight, her fingers brushing the grip with practiced familiarity. The young SEAL who had thrown the challenge signaled to a comrade. A target sled was wheeled out, the kind used to simulate moving enemies. They cranked the controls, setting it to dart back and forth at unpredictable speeds. Even among the SEALs, hitting it clean at distance with a pistol was nearly impossible. Most could land glancing shots, but precision hits? Rare. The men stood back, anticipation mixing with the kind of tension that makes hearts hammer and palms sweat. She raised the pistol. The target jolted into motion, zigzagging erratically across the far end of the field. Her arm tracked it, steady as a hawk's gaze, breath controlled, body unmoving except for the smooth pivot of her wrist. Then the shot cracked. The sled jolted, the target jerking as a neat hole punched through its center. A collective roar burst from the men, half disbelief, half something closer to fear. Before they could even fully process it, she fired again, another hole appearing, nearly overlapping the first. The sled clattered to a stop, riddled with precision strikes. The woman lowered the pistol, exhaled softly, and placed it back on the table as though it had never been a challenge at all. Silence fell heavier than before. The commander's chest rose and fell, rage and awe battling within him. His men looked shaken, their certainty splintered. They had spent years training to be the sharpest edge of the military blade, only to be shown up by a stranger who carried herself with the simplicity of someone folding laundry or tending a garden. Who was she? Where had she learned such skill? The questions pressed against their minds, but none dared ask. The commander finally stepped forward, his voice low and edged with steel. Who are you? It wasn't curiosity but demand, the kind of question that expects obedience. The woman met his eyes, calm as ever. No one, she said softly. The answer wasn't evasive. It was truth delivered with such weight that no one dared press further. No one. And yet she had done what none of them could. The contradiction unsettled them more than any revelation could have. The commander's pride burned. He could not let this stand. Enough games, he growled. If you're so skilled, let's see you in something real. He signaled, and two men stepped forward, dragging out training pads and protective gear. Close quarters. Hand to hand. Let's see if you're more than a trick shot. The men grinned with relief. Finally, something they understood, something they owned. Firearms could be unpredictable, but close combat was their domain. No stranger could walk into their world and best them there. They strapped on gear, rolling shoulders, smirking at the woman as if victory were already theirs. The commander folded his arms, watching, certain this would end the spectacle. But as the woman stepped onto the mat, removing her shoes with quiet care, a subtle shift rippled through the air. Those watching couldn't name it, but they felt it. Her stance, her breath, the way she moved, it carried the same serenity as her shooting. She bowed her head slightly as though acknowledging some invisible ritual, then raised her eyes again. The first SEAL lunged, powerful and fast, confident in his size and training. Her body flowed like water, sidestepping with effortless grace. A flick of her wrist, a pivot of her hip, and he was on the ground, staring up at the sky with stunned disbelief. Gasps erupted, some men shouting, others gaping. The second SEAL attacked with more caution, circling, feinting, then striking hard. Again, her movements were precise, minimal, beautiful in their simplicity. A shift, a twist, and he too was on the ground, pinned in an instant. The crowd was no longer laughing, no longer smirking. They stood transfixed, a mixture of fear and awe rooting them in place. The commander's throat tightened. Every attempt to put her in her place only elevated her higher. Every test only revealed deeper skill. She wasn't mocking them, wasn't seeking glory. That made it worse. She was simply being. And in her being, she revealed their limits with a gentleness that felt like humiliation. The men who prided themselves on strength now stared at her as though she were something not entirely human. She stepped off the mat, calm and quiet, leaving two of their best groaning on the ground. No one dared step forward to challenge her again. The commander clenched his fists. His men's eyes were no longer on him. Their awe no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her. And in that moment he realized something terrifying. Power was not always taken with noise and force. Sometimes it was revealed with silence, with calm, with a precision so perfect it could not be denied. She had walked into his world, a world of discipline, training and dominance, and without shouting, without posturing, without demanding, she had claimed it. He told himself it was temporary, that he would find the crack in her armor, the flaw in her perfection. But deep down, something in him knew the truth. The simple woman had come, and nothing about his camp, his men or himself would ever be the same. The camp didn't sleep that night. The sun had long since sunk beneath the horizon, But the murmurs continued in the barracks, in the mess hall, even along the perimeter fences where guards whispered between rounds. Men who were taught to be unshakable, to bury emotion under discipline, found themselves restless, replaying the impossible scenes in their heads. The ping of the bullet against steel still rang in their ears, the memory of her fluid movements still etched into their vision. They had tried to dismiss it, tried to laugh it away, but each attempt only deepened the gnawing question that no one dared say aloud. If she could do all of that, then what was she? The commander's office glowed late into the night. He sat behind his desk, broad shoulders hunched, fists clenched tight against polished wood. Reports lay scattered around him, forgotten. His mind churned, seething with a storm he couldn't contain. He had been embarrassed before. No soldier with years of service was a stranger to mistakes, but this was different. This cut deeper. His authority had been undermined, his men's loyalty shaken, and worst of all, it had been done by someone who didn't even seek to humiliate him. Her calmness was the knife that twisted deeper with every thought. He lit a cigarette, dragged hard, and stared at the faint curl of smoke. Who was she? He needed answers. The next morning, the woman returned to the field as if nothing unusual had happened. She stood at the edge again, quiet, watching. Some of the men avoided looking at her, ashamed of their own doubt. Others looked too much, their eyes following her with curiosity that bordered on reverence. Whispers followed her footsteps, but she seemed not to hear them, or perhaps she didn't care. The commander emerged, his jaw set, his eyes dark. His men straightened immediately, but he didn't look at them. His gaze locked onto her. He had spent half the night searching records, checking visitor logs, cross-referencing names. Nothing. No files, no background, nothing that explained her presence here. She had appeared out of nowhere. Why are you here? His voice cut across the field like a blade. It wasn't the playful mocking of before, nor the frustrated challenge of yesterday. This time it was demand, sharp and dangerous. The men held their breath, waiting. The woman turned her head slowly toward him, her eyes calm, her voice soft but steady. To watch. That was all. 2 words delivered with the weight of truth. The commander's face hardened. To watch. Watch what? Watch them fail. Watch them break. He took a step closer, his presence towering, his tone low and threatening. Who sent you? Her gaze didn't waver. No one. The commander's teeth ground together. He wanted to shout, to tear away her mask, but every instinct warned him that pressing too hard would only deepen her power over his men. He needed strategy. He barked at his men to return to drills, and the camp thundered with shouts and gunfire once more. Yet their focus was fractured. No matter how loud the rifles cracked or how heavy the push-ups burned, their eyes strayed back to the quiet figure standing at the edge of the field. Later, during a break, the younger SEAL who had thrown the pistol at her approached cautiously. He had been the boldest yesterday, but something in him had shifted. He wasn't mocking now. "Ma'am," he began awkwardly, "where did you learn to shoot like that?" She glanced at him, a flicker of a smile touching her lips, small but genuine. "Long ago." The vagueness of the answer only deepened the mystery, but instead of frustrating him, it seemed to draw him in. He nodded, almost like a student receiving wisdom from a teacher. "Could you show me?" he asked hesitantly. The moment the words left his mouth, the commander's bark split the air. "Back in line." The young SEAL flinched and retreated, but the damage was done. The seed had been planted. Respect was shifting, piece by piece, away from the commander and toward the woman who gave no orders at all. That evening, during meal hour, the tension boiled over. The mess hall buzzed with chatter, bowls clattering, trays scraping. The woman sat alone at a corner table, eating with quiet composure. A few soldiers glanced her way as if considering joining her, but the weight of the commander's authority held them back. He entered moments later, the noise dimming under his presence. He stalked past rows of tables, his eyes never leaving her. Without invitation, he sat across from her, his tray untouched. "You're not just here to watch," he said, voice low, steady. "People like you don't just wander into places like this." She looked at him, calm as ever, and answered simply, "Perhaps." The vague response burned him. He slammed his palm on the table, rattling trays nearby. "I don't like riddles," he growled. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with something that looked almost like pity. "Then stop asking questions you don't want answers to." Her tone was not sharp, not angry. It was quiet, but it carried the force of a strike. The commander's face darkened, but before he could lash out, she rose smoothly, placed her tray aside, and walked out of the hall without another word. The silence that followed her departure was deafening. Every eye had been on them. Every ear had heard. And in that silence, the commander felt something he hadn't felt in years, doubt gnawing at the foundations of his authority. That night he couldn't sleep again. Her words replayed, sharp and heavy. Stop asking questions you don't want answers to. What did that mean? He replayed her movements, her skill, her composure. She wasn't military. He was sure of that. But she wasn't civilian either. He thought of the way she handled the pistol, the rifle, the hand-to-hand combat. It wasn't just training. It was mastery. Mastery that came from years, maybe decades. And yet her face bore no mark of age that would explain it. She could have been 30. She could have been 50. He didn't know. That ignorance enraged him. The men whispered louder the next day. Some said she was a retired operative, others that she was CIA Black Ops, some secret ghost who had wandered into their lives to test them. A few whispered darker things, that she wasn't human at all, that no one could move or shoot like that. The commander shut them down, barked orders, punished with extra drills, but even he could hear the tone of their whispers. It wasn't fear of him anymore. It was fascination with her. He decided to test her himself. That afternoon he stripped down to his combat gear and strode to the field where she stood. "You and me," he said, tossing a rifle at her feet. 100 yards. Moving targets. No rest. First to miss loses. His men crowded around, their energy electric. She regarded him, bent, picked up the rifle. For the first time something flickered in her eyes, not amusement, not arrogance, but something close to weariness, as though she had already walked this path before. Still she nodded. Targets sprang to life, darting side to side. He fired, crisp and controlled, striking the first. She fired, hers landing dead center. They moved in rhythm, the crack of rifles blending, steel ringing in reply. Sweat rolled down his brow, muscles tensing, every ounce of focus strained. But her breathing never changed. Her shots never faltered. The targets fell one by one until only the last remained, jerking unpredictably, weaving faster than the rest. He steadied, fired, and missed. Dirt kicked up inches from the steel. Before the echo of his shot faded, hers rang out, a clean hit dead center. The silence that followed was suffocating. His chest heaved, fury burning in his veins. She lowered her rifle with serene calm, set it down, and without a word began to walk away. His men didn't cheer. They didn't laugh. They only stared. Because they knew. They had watched. And there was no denying it now. Their commander had been bested, clean and clear, by a woman who claimed to be no one. As she disappeared into the distance, the commander felt something break inside him. His men would follow his orders, yes, but their eyes would never look at him the same way. He had spent years carving himself into the image of strength, authority, and control. But in a single week, a simple woman had unraveled it all. And though he hated her for it, a darker, more dangerous feeling coiled beneath his rage. He needed to know the truth about her, no matter what it cost. The storm inside the commander didn't settle. It grew. Days blurred together in a haze of frustration and restless fury. He had been trained to adapt, to overcome, to bend chaos to his will. Yet this woman, this quiet stranger, was chaos itself, wrapped in calm skin. She hadn't shouted, hadn't bragged, hadn't sought the spotlight, yet her presence alone was rewriting the camp's hierarchy. That was unacceptable. Authority wasn't just about skill, it was about perception. And perception was slipping from his hands like water through clenched fists. He began digging in earnest. By day he barked orders louder than ever, driving his men harder, punishing the slightest slip. By night, he sat hunched over his desk, combing through every scrap of information he could find. Visitor logs, security footage, personnel rosters. Nothing gave him answers. She was a ghost, appearing out of nowhere, vanishing into the quiet corners of the camp as if she belonged to no world they knew. He made calls to contacts in intelligence, hinting at a potential breach, but even there, silence answered. It was as if she didn't exist. And that was more terrifying than anything else. Meanwhile, the men changed in ways he couldn't ignore. He saw it in their eyes. Respect for him had turned into obedience, mechanical, cold, stripped of loyalty. But when they glanced at her when she walked past, their expressions softened with something deeper. Admiration, awe, even reverence. They didn't speak openly, but he heard the whispers carried on the wind. They called her ghost, shadow, teacher. Some said she had come to test them, to show them a higher standard. The commander seethed at the thought. He was their standard. He was their leader. And he refused to share that with anyone, least of all her. So he devised something cruel. If her skill was unshakable, then he would shake her spirit. He announced a night operation, framed as a surprise drill. The men suited up in combat gear, adrenaline already humming. The mission: infiltrate the forest beyond the camp perimeter, navigate through a network of mock traps and hidden obstacles, and retrieve a flag planted miles deep in the darkness. Normally it was a test for new recruits, but tonight he had modified it. The traps would be harsher, the terrain less forgiving, the challenges stacked high. And he made certain she knew she was expected to join. When the order came, the men looked at her instinctively. She gave no sign of protest. She simply picked up the gear handed to her, lighter, mismatched compared to their standard issue, but wore it without hesitation. They moved out as the sun dipped below the horizon, swallowed by the vast forest. The trees loomed, shadows thick, the air damp with the scent of moss and earth. Branches creaked overhead and the ground shifted under their boots. The commander led at first, but his eyes flicked back often, watching her. She moved through the underbrush with uncanny ease, her steps nearly soundless. While others stumbled on roots or brushed against branches, she seemed to weave through without effort, like the forest itself parted for her. The first trap was a shallow pit covered with leaves. A recruit stumbled, nearly fell, and cursed. Before the commander could bark at him, she was there, one hand gripping his vest, pulling him back effortlessly. She didn't lecture, didn't scold. Just set him right and continued forward. The men glanced at each other, shaken by the simplicity of it. More obstacles followed, swinging logs, hidden snares, slick inclines, but each time she moved with fluid precision, helping those who faltered without fanfare. What unsettled the commander most wasn't that she succeeded, it was that she inspired. With every obstacle passed, the men's confidence grew, not because of him but because of her. Hours passed, the forest thickening, moonlight slanting through the canopy in fractured beams. They reached a ravine, a gap too wide to cross without ropes. Normally this was where teamwork showed, rigging lines, supporting each other across. The commander barked orders, but the men hesitated, their eyes flicking again to her. Without a word, she slung a rope around a tree, tested the knot, and leapt. For a moment she seemed weightless, the arc of her swing cutting across the chasm like a shadow against the stars. She landed silent, steady, and anchored the line from the far side. Only then did she gesture for the others to follow. One by one they crossed, and with each passage the commander's anger deepened. He had meant this drill to expose her, to break her. Instead, she was weaving herself deeper into his men's respect. When the last man crossed, they pushed onward, until at last the flag shimmered faintly in the moonlight, tied to a branch deep within the forest. The commander reached for it, but before his fingers touched the fabric, she was already there, pulling it free. She held it lightly, not claiming victory but simply because it was the task. She handed it to him without a word, her expression unchanged. That simple act, offering it to him as though still acknowledging him as leader, felt like salt ground into his wounds. On the march back, the men spoke quietly, their voices tinged with something like pride. Not for themselves, not for him, but for her. They had seen perfection tonight, not arrogance, not dominance, but a calm strength that lifted them higher than they thought possible. And it terrified the commander. For the first time in his career, he felt his men slipping from his grasp, their loyalty no longer tethered solely to him. Back at camp, the firelight cast harsh shadows across their faces. The men dropped gear, wiped sweat, shared tired laughs. She sat apart, as always, quiet, her eyes turned toward the flames. The commander stood rigid nearby, his fists clenched, his jaw aching from the force of his teeth grinding together. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, to tear away the mystery. But when her eyes lifted briefly, meeting his across the fire, he froze. There was no defiance there, no mockery. Only calm. And for a split second he saw something else in her gaze, something vast, something that made him feel small in a way he hadn't since he was a boy staring up at the stars. That night he didn't sleep again. He stared at the ceiling, replaying every step of the mission, every glance from his men, every movement of hers. She hadn't come to challenge him, hadn't come to take his authority, and yet she had. Simply by being who she was, she had exposed his limits. He thought of all the missions he had led, the medals on his chest, the respect he had earned. None of it mattered now. Because respect given freely was more powerful than authority enforced. And his men had given theirs to her. His obsession deepened. He sent new inquiries out, called in old favors, even risked breaching protocol by accessing classified systems. Still nothing. No records, no history, no trace. It was as if she had stepped into existence the moment she walked into his camp. He began to wonder if the whispers were true, if she wasn't of this world, if she was something else entirely. The thought should have been absurd, but after what he had seen, nothing felt impossible anymore. And beneath all his rage, all his suspicion, a seed of something dangerous began to grow, a kind of twisted respect, a recognition he hated to admit. She was more than him. More than all of them. And though he vowed to expose her, to break her, another darker truth gnawed at the back of his mind. Perhaps she was unbreakable. The murmur spread through the camp like a low rumble, not unlike the distant echo of thunder over the ocean. Everyone was talking about her now, no longer in mocking tones but with an edge of wary respect, as though they had glimpsed something they didn't quite understand. Some whispered she was ex-military who had somehow slipped under the radar. Others speculated she was the widow of a sniper, carrying secrets no one dared probe too deeply. But to the woman herself, all of that noise was irrelevant. She rose early every morning, dressed plainly, and carried herself with the same calm poise she always had. What changed was the way people watched her. The eyes that once dismissed her now tracked her every movement, as though waiting for her to reveal another hidden layer. The SEAL officer who had scoffed at her earlier tried to maintain his authority, but even he couldn't quite erase the memory of her standing with steady hands, striking the impossible target as if it were no harder than setting a cup on a shelf. He found himself replaying the scene at night, troubled not just by her skill but by the unshakable composure she displayed. He had seen men miss under less pressure, their hands trembling, their breathing ragged. Yet she was serene, almost detached, as though the act of hitting the target had never been in doubt. Pride warred with curiosity in his chest, and more than once he thought about approaching her, only to stop, afraid of what he might find if he asked the wrong question. Training intensified as the days went by. The men were pushed harder, the drills becoming more complex and demanding. The obstacle courses grew longer, the endurance tests harsher. Through it all she never faltered. When they crawled through mud under live fire, she moved with silent precision. When they were forced to carry logs across uneven ground until their muscles screamed, she lifted her share without a word, her face showing neither struggle nor complaint. Some men began falling behind, collapsing under the weight, but she pressed on, steady as a metronome, her strength not flashy but inexhaustible. Her simplicity was her weapon. She never tried to impress, never sought attention, yet attention was drawn to her like iron filings to a magnet. One night, after a particularly grueling endurance march, the camp gathered near the mess hall, bodies aching and spirits frayed. Conversations ebbed and flowed in low voices, exhaustion tempering the usual bravado. She sat a little apart, sipping water slowly, eyes reflecting the dim lantern light. A young recruit, barely more than a boy, broke from the group and approached her. His pride had been shattered earlier that day when he had collapsed midway through a drill, humiliated before his comrades. He sat beside her, awkward and uncertain. "How do you do it?" he whispered. She turned to him, her gaze steady, patient, as though she had been expecting the question all along. "You don't fight the pain," she said quietly. "You listen to it. Pain tells you where your limits are. But limits lie. Push gently, step by step, and the body learns it can go further than it believes." The boy frowned, and used to hearing such things put so simply. Yet in her voice there was no arrogance, no lecture, only the gentle sharing of something lived and known. He nodded slowly, something settling in his chest, and when he left her side, his shoulders no longer slumped with defeat. Word of that small exchange spread, carried by whispers, and soon others began to look to her not just for skill but for guidance. The officer noticed this shift and felt a pang of unease. Authority in such a place was a delicate balance, forged through both command and respect. And here was this woman, without rank or official place, drawing eyes, earning trust, becoming a quiet axis around which morale began to turn. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but something held him back. Instead, he watched from the shadows, studying her with the same intensity he once reserved for enemies. He tried to tell himself it was about maintaining order, but beneath that excuse lay a gnawing fascination he could not shake. The next challenge came in the form of night operations. The recruits were blindfolded, led into the forest, and told to find their way back with only instinct and fragments of orientation training to guide them. Many stumbled in circles, disoriented by the darkness and the cacophony of night creatures. Yet she moved through the trees as if guided by some inner compass, each step purposeful, every pause deliberate. At one point she crouched, touched the earth with her fingers and adjusted her path. When dawn broke, she was among the first to return, her face calm, while others stumbled and exhausted much later, scraped and defeated. That night, when the camp finally slept, the officer found himself restless. He paced outside his tent, the sea wind carrying the scent of salt and pine. His mind circled around the woman like a hawk, trying to grasp what eluded him. Finally, driven by something deeper than curiosity, he walked toward the edge of the camp where she often sat alone. She was there as if waiting, her silhouette framed against the pale glow of the moon. He hesitated, then spoke. "Who taught you to shoot like that?" His voice carried more tension than he intended. She looked up, eyes reflecting the moonlight, unflinching. "No one," she said simply. "I learned because I had to." He frowned at the answer, unsatisfied. "Everyone learns from someone," he pressed. But she only tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Sometimes the world is teacher enough," she replied. Her tone wasn't defiant, but it closed the door firmly on further questioning. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant crash of waves. Finally he nodded, unwilling to admit defeat, but sensing he would get no more from her tonight. As he walked away, her calm voice followed him like a whisper, not loud enough to grasp but heavy enough to weigh on his thoughts. The days blurred together into the rhythm of drills, tests, and exhaustion. Yet with each challenge, the woman seemed to grow in stature, not through arrogance but through a quiet resilience that others could not ignore. Men began timing themselves by her pace, pushing harder because she pushed without ever seeming to tire. They began watching her in the firing range, trying to steady their breathing as she did, trying to imitate the stillness that preceded her every shot. Even the officer, despite himself, found his own aim improving when he recalled the serenity on her face. She had become, without intention, a silent instructor, reshaping the very culture of the camp. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the sky with crimson streaks, the recruits gathered around a fire, a rare moment of camaraderie without drill or demand. Someone asked her to tell a story about herself, something from her past. She shook her head softly. "My story is not for entertainment," she said. Disappointed murmurs followed, but then she added, "But I can tell you this, the hardest battles are not the ones fought with guns or fists. They're the ones fought in silence, inside yourself, when no one else can see." Her words fell into the quiet night like stones into still water, rippling outward until each man felt them settle somewhere deep inside. And in that silence, a new respect took root, one not forced by authority but freely given, drawn from something beyond understanding. The desert training ground was alive with motion as dawn broke, painting the horizon in pale fire. The SEAL camp had become a crucible of discipline and intensity, but now it was also the arena where the mystery of one woman kept unfolding. Sarah, the quiet outsider who had come under curious circumstances, had already shattered expectations time and time again. The men had watched her endure grueling drills without complaint, handle live combat scenarios with uncanny calm, and prove her precision in ways none thought possible. But what was happening now was different, because the officers had begun designing tasks specifically to break her, as if desperate to prove that her success so far had been nothing but luck. The air was thick with tension that morning as the new challenge was announced. A long-distance navigation and survival course, spanning nearly 40 miles of broken wilderness terrain. No GPS, no maps, and no external help. Just a compass, a canteen, and whatever survival skills they carried in their heads. The men murmured among themselves, sizing up the task. This was the kind of thing that tested endurance beyond muscle. This tested mind, instinct, and will. Sarah stood quietly among them, her hands relaxed at her sides, her face unreadable. She did not look like someone about to endure days of punishing isolation in the wilderness. Some of the men whispered that she would finally crack. Others watched her with a gnawing unease, as though a part of them already knew she would come back with another story that would turn their world upside down. The officer leading the exercise explained the rules. They would be dropped in staggered positions across the terrain. Each had to make it to the designated extraction point on the far side of the range. Along the way, natural obstacles, wildlife, and planted scenarios would test their ability to adapt. It wasn't just about finishing, it was about surviving smarter than the land and proving you had the mindset of a warrior. One by one, the SEAL candidates were driven out to their drop zones. Sarah's turn came last. The truck stopped in the middle of jagged hills, sand whipping against the metal frame. She climbed down wordlessly, clutching only her compass and canteen. The engine roared away, leaving her in silence broken only by the hiss of wind. The first few miles were steep climbs through uneven rock. The desert sun had barely risen, but already the heat was climbing. Sarah paced herself, conserving water, noting subtle trails of shade cast by tall rock formations. She seemed to see the land differently than most would, Her eyes lingered on tracks, on shifts of sand, on details others would ignore. When a rattlesnake coiled across her path, she did not panic. She waited, silent as the rocks, until it slithered away. By mid-afternoon, dehydration was setting in. Other seals, scattered across the terrain, were already cursing their luck. Some had drunk too much water too soon. Others struggled with the endless mirage of the desert. But Sarah? She had stopped in a shaded crevice and began digging with her bare hands. Hours passed, and though her palms bled, a thin trickle of moisture seeped from underground stone. She drank sparingly, her eyes closing briefly as if she drew strength from patience itself. 2 nights into the course, a brutal sandstorm swept across the wilderness. Many of the men huddled, blinded, choking, trying desperately to shield themselves. Some lost their compasses, others wandered in circles. Sarah wrapped her scarf across her face, crouched low, and moved not with panic but with precision, using the rhythm of the storm's gusts to guide her deeper into natural shelters. When dawn came again, the storm had claimed hours of progress from the men. But Sarah was already pressing forward, eyes sharp, feet steady. The real test came on the 4th day. The officers had arranged a simulated ambush near one of the water caches planted along the course. Hidden figures, trained SEAL instructors, lay in wait, meant to test the candidate's ability to think under fire. When Sarah approached, the trap was sprung. Gunfire cracked from the rocks, blanks but deafening all the same. Most candidates had run in panic, diving for cover or retreating entirely. But Sarah did not falter. She dropped low, scanning angles. Her movements were eerily fluid, her reactions fast but deliberate. She threw herself into cover, waited, and then moved not toward safety but toward the threat itself. The instructors, hidden behind rocks, were startled as they watched her advance with uncanny precision. She moved like someone who had lived combat before, anticipating fire, using terrain like second nature. By the time the ambush was called off, Sarah had maneuvered close enough to take out half the attackers with nothing but thrown stones and improvised distraction tactics. The instructors exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't luck. This wasn't guesswork. She fought like she had lived this for years. By the 6th day, exhaustion had broken nearly half the men. Some had been retrieved by medics. Others stumbled onward, dehydrated and delirious. But when Sarah appeared at the extraction point, she was upright, her steps steady, her eyes as calm as the day she began. She wasn't untouched, her face was wind-burned, her hands cut, her body bruised. But she carried herself like she belonged there, like the desert had been a test she was always meant to pass. The officers waited, jaws tight, as she approached. One of them, the same man who had mocked her at the shooting range weeks earlier, stepped forward. "How?" he demanded, though the question was more a whisper than an accusation. Sarah only shrugged. "You survive by listening," she said quietly. "The land tells you everything you need to know if you stop trying to fight it."